or public affairs. If you have a comment about our operations, please write us at the C-SPAN Networks, 400 North Capitol Street, Suite 650, Washington, D.C. Our zip code is 20001.
On Capitol Hill Thursday, a group called the National Alliance of Families held a news conference to discuss its concerns about how the government has handled POW MIA issues over the years. There were a number of speakers at the briefing, among them New Hampshire Senator Bob Smith. Senator Smith recently returned from a fact-finding mission to Southeast Asia, where he attempted to check out the credibility of witnesses who have reported live sightings of servicemen reported as missing in action from the Vietnam War. Joining Senator Smith were former prisoners of war and Ross Perot. The National Alliance of Families is an organization that works to gather information on and create public awareness of POW MIA matters. Thursday's news conference is coming next on C-SPAN 2.
Welcome. Welcome. This is a sensational afternoon for two reasons. One is that the families are here together to talk and we're here today to talk with Mr. Perot. Mr. Perot has responded to our wanting to meet with him, to speak with him, and to talk about our live POWs that are still in foreign lands. I want you all to know that this is the beginning of a 3-day forum. You're all welcome to attend any of the forum. We have a lot of experts here to talk about the live POW issue. We hope that you'll stay on and continue on listening to this new information. And now I'm going to turn this meeting over to former Congressman John LaBoudiere.
Okay, so for all of you in the media and families and veterans, leaders, and United We Stand America folks, we thank you for coming. I want to tell you this is an unprecedented, and new generations of POW activists are here too. This is an unprecedented meeting of all families, all veterans, all POW activists. We all have come together today united on one theme: living American prisoners of war are still being held against their will in Southeast Asia and probably elsewhere. And we want to talk about that today with Mr. Perot. Up on the stage today, we have members of all groups, and I just want to introduce a few of you. At the far end, we have Dr. Jeff Donahue, whose brother is missing in Laos, who's an elected board member of the National League of Families. That's the other big POW group. Dolores is the national chairwoman of the National Alliance of Families. Next to him is Luann Laban, whose brother is missing in Laos. Next to her is Patty O'Grady Parcells, whose father is missing in Vietnam. She is married next to her to John Parcells, who's a former POW in Vietnam. They just recently went to Vietnam in the spring. Larry Stark next to them, a former POW returned. Next to them, Jerry Kiley, a Vietnam veteran, a leader in the Veterans of Foreign Wars and Vietnam Vets of America. Senator Smith will be introduced shortly. Irene Mandra, Korean veterans. Deborah Robertson Bardsley, whose father is missing in Vietnam. Bill Souls and Gary Boyle, Korean families of men missing in Korea. And Mike Benj, former POW in Vietnam, returned. And next to him, Red McDaniel. So we have former POWs, family members of all groups, all here to discuss live POWs. And we thank Mr. Perot for coming. So what we're going to do today for the members of the media, we have a number of people, each of whom are going to speak about their particular knowledge of living American POWs. And we're going to start first with the co-author of this brand new book, The Men We Left Behind, Jim Sanders. And let me explain the format. Each person is going to speak. Each person will take questions. Any questions you have, please raise your hand and ask them, and let us discuss this issue openly and honestly in front of everybody. So let's start with Jim Sanders, co-author of this book.
Good afternoon. Next 5 minutes, I'll tell you everything that's in these 400 pages, or give it a try. Almost a year ago, in fact, about 8 months ago, Mark Souder and I started down the road of the manuscript of The Men We Left Behind. We became the proud recipients of classified, still classified documents, some technically declassified. We had some like this one here, which is a RAND report. You would think this thing should have been released years and years ago, because the RAND report, 1969, says that I'm as close to these things as I can get, I think. Is that better? Okay. Thank you very much. This 1969 RAND report says that in all probability, the Vietnamese communists will demand ransom for the American POWs that they are holding. But that the United States, although it should pay ransom to get its people back, great nations don't publicly pay ransom, so you don't call it ransom, you call it reconstruction aid. We came up, this report is still classified, although it's only confidential. It was not available, apparently, to the select committee. It's not in the final report. We came up with quite a number of documents going back to as far back as 1966, in which the United States government continually discussed the ransom hostage negotiations that they were going to have to engage in, and that they did engage in as the years went on. When Henry Kissinger began his secret negotiations in 1969, he was well apprised of the fact that it would take money to get our people back. And that is why on February 1st, 1973, that Nixon document was put on the table for $3.25 billion. It was an alleged offer of reconstruction aid, a palatable form of ransom. The problem is there were significant political problems at that time. Watergate, some of us old people can remember that, was a rather significant problem, and it simply apparently was not possible for them to go to the Congress and say, folks, we have hundreds of Americans being held hostage who aren't going to come home. So after March 28th, 1973, a decision was made within the United States government that these people had to be walked away from, abandoned. They were made for political reasons, good, bad, or indifferent. It's up to you to decide, but in fact, a decision was made. They were abandoned. The Vietnamese, however, decided that they wanted their money. They continued to come back as long as the Nixon-Ford administration was in power and Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. They continued to come back and try to get their money. But the United States decided to go with its humane plan rather than continuing to discuss the hostage politics that had gone on since 1969. So in any case, Nixon leaves office, Ford leaves office, Carter comes into office, and he was given a chance to buy back the POWs and elected not to. That the Iranian hostage crisis, I think, would give you a very good idea of what kind of problems any president would have if they publicly acknowledged that we owe the Vietnamese money, or at least they believe we owe them money, and they want their money in order if they're going to give our people back. Every president who came into office up to Reagan was given the opportunity to buy POWs back. On February 12th, 1984, the Reagan administration made the Vietnamese an offer to sensitively and quietly repatriate American POWs being held by the Vietnamese. Sensitively and quietly means secretly. We don't have the documents that outline secretly, but within the government, when you make an offer to another government, you have a very detailed plan of action that tells the other side how, if we're going to secretly do it, how are you going to? How's Kay Basilovac's husband, if he's alive? How is he going to be bought out, or is he perhaps not going to be bought out? Only certain select types. We don't know what the details of the offer were, but we know the offer was made. Rather suspect that part of it may have, in fact, been carried out, but we don't have conclusive evidence at this time. Those are the basic bare facts of the research that I did that went into this book. Unfortunately, at this time, we're dealing with, out in the public, we're dealing with politically correct history. Politically correct history says that, in fact, we think there may be some people there, but we're not sure that there's some people there. And so now we're going to do IMF loans to make folks feel better over in Vietnam, and maybe they'll feel more friendly and maybe someone will come home. Well, historically accurate history is, in fact, what we have to do. If the United States government will once and for all declassify the documents that are historically correct, give a historically correct analysis of how we were dragged into hostage politics and how we were forced to put that money on the table and how we made an effort with what little room to maneuver Kissinger and Nixon had at the time, how they tried to put money on the table, money they couldn't deliver on, but they made an effort. Tell the truth about it. That forces onto the world stage the truth. It forces the Vietnamese and the American governments to deal with reality and not political correctness. If we can force the governments involved to deal with historical reality, we have the opportunity at long last to bring any of those hostages, and they were hostages, and if they haven't killed them all recently, they are still hostages there, to bring them home. And that's why we're all here today. That's why Mark and I went down the path of writing this book. And if we can historically and accurately discuss this on the world stage, I believe, Mark Souder believes, and I think just about everybody here today believes, that we will finally at long last bring some of these people home. That's what the book's about.
Okay, we apologize. We know the volume's not loud enough. We're working on it back here. We're going to keep going. We'll ask each speaker to speak loudly. Our next speaker is Senator Bob Smith, just returned Monday from his latest trip to Vietnam. He's the vice chairman of last year's Senate Select Committee and a longtime champion of the cause of living POWs. Senator Smith.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't very often get a standing ovation at a press conference. I was trying to see which reporter stood up. There are a lot of people here who wish to address the audience and the press, so I'm going to be very brief because I'm going to be speaking, as you know, to the Alliance tonight somewhere around 7 o'clock. So I'll go into more detail there, but I know that Mr. Perot also is going to speak. Yeah, they're not picking it up, are they? All right, I'll try to be a little louder. The mics are too low for me, John. Let me just say that I'm very proud to be anywhere with Ross Perot, but especially on this issue where this man has given so much of his effort much of his time and to his country and for the behalf of these men, not only during the war, but after the war. He's deeply concerned about the issue of living prisoners. That's why he's here. You all know that. And he is a very valuable ally for those men in America today, probably one of the most important, if not the most important. Let me just, if you think, you wonder if we have a problem, let me read to you one line from the statement by the President of the United States on July 2nd, 1993. Quote, as of June 19th, no active live sighting cases required further investigation in Vietnam, unquote. Well, I just came back from Vietnam, as John just said, and Billy Hendon was there privately. He was kind enough to brief me on the access that he had while he was there. I invited him to go along with me on the part of the delegation trip that I was there for, and we found 3 areas that we wanted to investigate. We had 3 areas that we wanted to investigate, and they were live sighting reports, contrary to what was said here by the President. And briefly, in one case was a prison called the Me Prison near Phu Ly, North Vietnam, in which the intelligence community said there was no such prison. That's what the report said. Therefore, the witness who said he saw live Americans in it was a fabricator. End of story. The only problem was we had a little problem for the intelligence community because Hendon and I went into the prison and walked around the prison with the diagram that the man drew, that the source drew. That's point number 1. So when we say there are no live sighting reports active, that may be the case. They're not active, but they sure as hell ought to be active. And the second one was a case where there was a special detention facility, the source said, in another prison in Vietnam, and in that special detention facility, he saw a man, the source said, chained to a metal bunk with an iron bar and a leg manacle. And the man's name was Jackson. That's what the source said. The DIA, or the intelligence community, said, and in the debunking of the source, that there was no special detention facility. Therefore, if there's no special detention facility in the prison, there couldn't be a bunk bed, nor could there be manacles, nor could there be Jackson. The source also said that there was an infirmary in the prison, somewhere in the vicinity of the special detention facility of the prison, where there were 20 beds. So Hendon and I went to the facility, found the special detention facility immediately by simply asking the camp commander if there was one. He said, yes, there is. We said, may we go in it? He said, yes. So we went in, and we found a room with a metal bunk bed. Ironically, the only room in the whole special detention facility with a metal bunk bed. We asked if there was an iron bar to go to that bunk bed because it wasn't there, and they said, yes, it's in the next room. So they then produced the iron bar. We also saw the manacles. Jackson wasn't there. But let me tell you something. When you hear these stories about no live reports being pursued, the ironic truth is they're not. But they ought to be. And I have to tell you, you had a United States Senator and a former congressman and a family member, Beth Stewart, crawling around dirty prison cells for hours, trying to find inscriptions on the wall of our men, and we can't get our own intelligence community to go out and do this. It's outrageous. And you need to know that. You need to know that because they're your men. You have the most at stake. They belong to you. You're the family members. And finally, the case of Robert Garwood. This man has been discredited as a witness for some 15 to 18 years. I've read every single line the DIA and the intelligence community ever wrote about him, and I've interviewed him for days at a time, both informally and as well within the DIA debriefings that Garwood gave them. He always maintained he saw live Americans in a number of places. Let me focus on one, on an island called Tak Ba Lake, where he said he saw Americans being detained. The debris, after years of pressing, we finally got the DIA to go out there and look, and they came back with a report that said, there is no detention facility out there on the island We can't find it. We can't find any masonry buildings that he said were on the island. We can't find the island. We can't find anything that looks or resembles like what he says. Therefore, if all that's false, he is a fabricator. He couldn't have seen POWs in a detention facility that didn't exist. So after hearing that, I spoke to Mr. Garwood, and I asked him if he would go to Vietnam with me. And yes, he would. He said he'd like to go. He'd be willing to take me there if he could find it. He said, no guarantees. It's been a long time, Senator, but I'll do my best. I said, well, that's all that I can ask. The government refused to pay, so it was funded privately. So there's not anybody that tells you Garwood was funded by the taxpayers is not true. So we went out to the boat landing on Tak Ba Lake. And we went out on the boat, Garwood leading the way. He's out in the front. We rode around in the lake for a little while. He kind of looked over at this one area where there were looked to be three islands together out into the lake. He directed us over there. There were two masonry buildings on the island, just as he said in his deposition to the committee. We docked the boat. We got out. We walked around, and he led us to the location where the generator was that he said he saw, and the buildings that he described in his deposition under oath were exactly as he described them in his deposition, and they were right there. So when you say Garwood is a liar because there is no island location with masonry buildings, it's simply not true. So here again, we have another witness who is credible, and yet we still don't have live sighting investigation reports active. The Vietnamese know that. They know that, and it doesn't make us look very good, very frankly, in trying to account for these men. So I'll have more to say about it tonight, and there are other people here that want to speak, but let me just say this. We have a problem in this country in terms of accountability for these men, and we're going to have to decide what we're going to do about it. It's absolutely outrageous to say that there are no active live sighting reports. As I said before, there are none active, but they ought to be active. If Bill Hendon and Bob Smith can go over there and find three of them that quickly, facilities, locations, whatever, that they say don't exist, there's something wrong. Now, some people say, well, you're charging conspiracy. I'm not charging anything. I'm telling you what the facts are. You can believe it one way or the other. Is the intelligence community, which is generally accepted to be, perhaps with the exception of the Israelis, the best in the world? Are they so bad that they can't find in 20 minutes what we found in 20 minutes, a facility? They can't find that with all the assets they have? That's your call. You figure that out for yourself. But the point is, they can't find a prison when the grid coordinates by the source are given to them. The grid coordinates were given to that prison, and they couldn't find that. We drove into it. It was a huge prison. It wasn't like it was a little dot on the map somewhere. So these are the kind of things that concern me. I've worked on this issue a long time. You've been at it longer than I have because you're the family members. But let me tell you, there's a real problem in this country, and somebody's going to have to expose it, and I'm just going to conclude on this point and go into more detail on it tonight. I don't care about the criticism I get. I don't care if people criticize me for criticizing my government. Let me just say this, please. Let me end on this point. The Vietnamese have an excuse. We lost the war. They have an excuse. We lost the war. They're not about to account for people unless we make them do it. That's their excuse, okay? What's our excuse? Why is it that we have this kind of thing happen? It's not right. Now, I've called for a criminal investigation on the people that did this. Questions I really may have.
Okay. I think we ought to have good questions now. Senator Smith may have to go back to Senate business, so he's going to take a couple of questions from the media now, because he's going to have to leave. All the other speakers so far and coming up are going to stay and will be available to the media during and after this press conference. Just to remind you all, Mr. Perot, after he speaks at this press conference and takes your questions, has asked to have a private meeting in this room with the families The media will be taken, hopefully, out in the hallway, and all of the folks who are speaking and experts that we've assembled here will be available in the hallway for further questioning during that speech. But Senator Smith, if you have any questions in the media, please ask them.
Let me just say before your questions, I'm very self-conscious of the fact there are a lot of people here, including Mr. Perot. I'll just take a couple of questions with brief answers, and I'll give you all the opportunity tonight that you like for questions when I speak tonight. So if we could just try to be brief, I'd appreciate it for their sake. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us how the Vietnamese reacted when you presented the information about Wallace Hines in your meeting there? Did they...
Man, you ought to be working for the DIA. You got pretty good intelligence there. I don't want to comment on any particular person at this time, but I will say this, that we presented the Vietnamese some information regarding individuals that were not on the so-called discrepancy list that the Vietnamese, by their own admission, captured. Now, if somebody could please tell me why somebody that the Vietnamese have admitted that they've captured, that they've never returned, why in the world would that person not be on our discrepancy list? You can answer that question for me, then you're better than I am. I can't figure that out, and neither could the Vietnamese, frankly. They were really making a mockery of it. You know, they really were. They were just saying to us, you know, Senator, really, we don't understand. Your people come over here, they don't talk about live sightings. They want to go out and dig around in the countryside, dig up crash sites and dig up bones. You're here talking about live Americans. We don't get it. I said, well, frankly, I don't get it either. But I'm here, and we want to go to these sites, and they took us. I have to say, and I can't figure this out either. I mean, obviously, we didn't expect them to take us somewhere where they were holding prisoners, but they took us, and I think Billy Hendon will substantiate this, any place we wanted to go. We took the best intelligence that we could come up with, and we asked to go to the locations that we wanted to, no second choices, first choice, and we went to every one of them. We were provided access everywhere we wanted to go. We spent hours going through individual prison cells, and still they gave us all of that access. So on that point, I salute the Vietnamese for at least giving us that opportunity. But what they were saying to us is the professionals over there who are doing the investigation for you and for America are not asking to do live sighting investigations. And as I said, the president has already bagged it. So, yes, ma'am.
Please comment on news reports that Commerce Secretary Ron Brown has accepted a payoff from the Vietnamese government in exchange for the lifting of the trade embargo and selling out the POWs.
I do not honestly have any knowledge of that one way or the other. That's the first I've heard of it is what you just said to me. Yes.
Senator Smith, God has been with us all this time, and I feel in my heart that he's placed you right here, right now, because we need you in your spot.
Well, thank you very much. Let me turn this over to some other people now. Thank you.
Okay, Dina wants you to go. Okay, I think in light of Senator Smith's comments about the Vietnamese and their activities, we have another take on this issue from a slightly different angle. I'd like to ask Mr. Kai to come here now, please. We have for you Lee Quang Kai. 11 years he worked in the Vietnamese Foreign Ministry in Hanoi and at the Vietnamese mission to the United Nations. He is no longer working for the government of Vietnam. He is here to speak of his knowledge of the Vietnamese government's policy of keeping prisoners behind at the end of the war in a second prison system. Now, I want to caution you, Mr. Kai speaks quite softly. I will ask him to speak up as loudly as he can in these microphones, and bear with him and hope that you can hear him. And he also will take questions later and will be available later to speak. This is his first time ever at a press conference in the United States. I present to you Lee Quang Kai.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's my honor to be here today, and it's my honor to work on the issue that I picked about 2 years ago. I decided to pick this issue because it just, everyone knows that the Vietnam War was a mistake, was a terrible mistake. And it was a strange experience, both the way it started. It was not officially started, and the official Thank you. And it, I'm sorry.
That's not going to work. Feedback because he's got this mic. Just put that one back over. Hopefully that's going to work.
Let's leave it there.
You got too much feedback.
Just readjust 1 second. Let me just take the main speaker. I'm not sure what's causing it right now, as a matter of fact. Try that.
There we go.
thank you. Thank you. And it is even more strange that the official peace accord that's supposed to end the war didn't work well. And the war, to me and to all family members here, is not over yet. It's not ended yet. So the most painful experience from the war is the POW, and the victim who suffered most is the family member. So both for American families as well as Vietnamese families. It was a fact. Everyone, and many people know that it becomes the fact now. Many people acknowledge that the issue is not handled well. So that's why it's still an issue today. And according to my experience working for the government in the foreign ministry for 11 years, I know that men were kept after the war. And the issue has never been handled through the official channel properly. So I'm here to show my support for family members and to show my support for the people who devoted themselves to work on the issue. And I believe that a lot of things that government cannot solve, the people can do it. The government pushed us to wars. They didn't know how to bring us out of the war. We are the one who have to try it. The family members and those who believe that we can do something to push the issue forward and to solve the painful experience, the problem for the family members, and to have the peoples of the true country have a better future. And that's all I wish to say today, and I'm open for questions after this session. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is a former congressional investigator and a very well-known author and historian who has some fascinating stories about live prisoners being held against their will up till now, and that is Al Santoli.
Thank you. I'm going to keep my remarks brief because I think it's important that Mr. Perot have this podium. All I would like to say is that in the past months, since the Senate Select Committee ended, there has been a large amount of classified documents that have been declassified that lead to some very, very troubling questions regarding the transfer of American prisoners to the Soviet Union, to China, and it also brings up the fact that our own intelligence community has been tracking American prisoners within the Laotian prison system that is controlled, by and large, by the Vietnamese. And until the Vietnamese come up with answers about Laos, about the transfer of prisoners during the war to China and to the Soviet Union, we cannot in our best conscience say that they are fully cooperating on this issue. Thank you.
Next speaker is Mike Benge, a former POW, who has some information about prisoners that were held while he was there who never came back. Mike.
I was captured in South Vietnam in 1968 by the North Vietnamese. I was held in a number of camps in South Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and North Vietnam, and lastly released out of the Hanoi Hilton in 1973. While I was in a prison camp just below the Laotian border inside Cambodia in Mandal Kari province, I was held in a prison camp complex of which there was approximately 8 to 12 separate prison camps. While held in one prison camp, I saw upwards of a dozen Americans being taken up to other parts of this prison complex. And after getting with the other POWs who had been held in that prison complex, when I got with them in Hanoi and checked the dates, it was not them. There was one man who was held with me, and the last that I seen him before being transferred and headed up to Hanoi, he was still alive. He was never returned. I would like to relate something that happened when I was a POW. My sister went to a senator and asked him, "What can you do to get my brother out of Hanoi?" He referred her to a very well-known liberal lawyer. And when my sister met with this lawyer, he began discussing with her how much money my parents had. He told her that it was very feasible that I could be ransomed out of Hanoi, out of Vietnam, for a large sum of money if they could come up with it. He implied in the conversations that other family members had been approached and that some POWs had been ransomed out with large sums of money which had been transferred to Hanoi. My sister became very disturbed over this. She was at the time working for the district attorney, I guess, of our county, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Reserve Intelligence. They then went to the FBI, and they were wired and held a second meeting with this lawyer. And he again implied the same thing again and again. In legalistic Philadelphia lawyer talk, something that accordingly to the FBI he could not be held accountable for, but he repeatedly said the men can be ransomed out of Hanoi. This is what the whole thing is all about. Vietnam wants money. They want the IMF loans. I do not agree with it that we should pay Hanoi a dime until they have accounted for our men. I believe it is a mistake. I believe that it was a mistake for President Clinton to make a concession to the Japanese to lift the IMF loans before he went to Japan. We have a slight chance yet because the decision is made to lift those loans. That is not yet the taxpayer's dollar. I believe there will be a second round of which the American public, the American taxpayer, will be paying for the second round. We might have a chance if we all get together and block that round at that time. Let's not pay them for our missing men. That is ransom. A group of senators that recently went to Hanoi on Memorial Day came back and told the president that unless we were willing to reward Hanoi for their enormous cooperation, and I put that in quotes, they will not be forthcoming with information anymore. That is ransom. That is a ransom demand, and we would turn the Iranians down, we would turn Iraq down, and any terrorist group down if they gave us the same demand. And I feel that we should never pay ransom for our men in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Thank you.
The speaker before, Al Santoli, mentioned Vietnamese complicity in moving American prisoners to the East Bloc nations and the Soviet Union. I now would like to ask to speak Dr. Joseph Douglas, who's a defense analyst who has done consulting and has an interesting story to tell about the movement of prisoners from Vietnam to Eastern Europe. Dr. Douglas.
I think Al Santoli was exactly right when he said we have to look in places other than just Vietnam to find out what happened to the POWs. What I would like to do this afternoon is give you a few short words on the knowledge of what I believe to be the best first-hand witness of the movement of such POWs. This individual is a former Major General Jan Šejna from Czechoslovakia. At the time of the Vietnam War, General Šejna was a member of the Czech decision-making hierarchy. He was the Chief of Staff to the Minister of Defense, First Secretary of the party at the Ministry of Defense, and a member of the Minister's Collegium. He was also a member of the Central Committee, of the Presidium, of the National Assembly, of the main political administration, and of the Administrative Organs Department. He was in a position to know. I have talked extensively with General Šejna about what happened to American POWs from Korea and Vietnam. His information makes it quite clear to me why there exists so little definitive information on what happened, why so little information has been found, and why there's been no real assistance on the part of the Vietnamese or Russia, particularly Russia. Let me now provide the essence of his knowledge. In both the Korean War and Vietnam Wars, American POWs were used as guinea pigs in military medical experiments by the Soviets. They were used for a variety of things. They were used to test new medical procedures for handling military casualties. They were used to test chemical and biological warfare agents. They were used to test the ability of American soldiers to withstand severe psychological and physiological stress such as might be anticipated in general nuclear war. They were used to test new mind control and behavior modification drugs. And they were used to test lethality levels of nuclear radiation exposure and the long-term consequences of sublethal radiation exposure. From the very beginning, the Soviets stressed that the operation should be conducted so that no one would ever know. Extreme secrecy measures and deception were used to protect the integrity of the operation. It began in the Korean War. During the Korean War, an experimental hospital was constructed by the Czechs in North Korea. It was manned by Soviet and Czech military intelligence doctors. One year, they treated roughly 600 POWs. At the end of the year, roughly 100 remaining prisoners of the hospital were shipped back to the Soviet Union for further tests. There were 4 shipments of roughly 25 POWs each. They were first shipped to Czechoslovakia, and from Czechoslovakia, they were shipped to the Soviet Union. The same thing happened in Vietnam. In Vietnam, medical experiments were conducted in North Vietnam by North Vietnamese doctors, with Czech and Soviet doctors serving as advisors and monitoring the results. In Laos, Czech and Soviet doctors worked directly on POWs. And during the entire course of the war, American POWs were also shipped to the Soviet Union, where more sensitive and secret chemical and biological agents and drugs were tested on the POWs. A special dedicated network was established to collect POWs who were to be shipped to the Soviet Union. They were totally separated from other POWs from the instant of their capture. They were given special psychological interviews to make certain that no troublemakers were selected, and then they were shipped by plane to Czechoslovakia. This system was designed by a joint Soviet, Czech, and North Vietnamese military counterintelligence team. Up until Shana left in February 1968, there were 2 or 3 shipments of POWs each year. The shipments were generally about 25 people. There were several small shipments, and there was one large shipment in 1966 in which about 60 POWs were moved to the Soviet Union. These shipments were through Czechoslovakia for security so that the Soviets could deny that any POWs were ever shipped to the Soviet Union from Vietnam. The POWs were shipped by air. They landed at Zatak Military Air Base about 40 kilometers from Prague. They were then taken to a military counterintelligence barracks in Prague, where they stayed for about a week. They were given physical exams during this time by doctors at the Central Military Hospital and then flown to the Soviet Union. General Shana, in his capacity as a top-ranking official, often witnessed the unloading of the POWs at the air base and at the barracks. He was present at discussions and took part in discussions with North Vietnamese, Soviet, and Czech leaders about the POW operation. He was responsible for preparing many of the actual decision documents. He also monitored parts of the operation and read reports on the results of the various experiments. This is but a brief summary of General Shana's firsthand knowledge of what happened. Based on our discussions over the past year, I would estimate that well over 1,000 American POWs got caught up in this Soviet military intelligence operation. And I should add that there was also a Chinese operation similarly conducted that also used American POWs from both the Korean and Vietnam wars. It was unfortunate that General Shana was unable to be present this afternoon as he intended to be to present this material himself. I do know that he wanted to be present, and I hope that he will be here tomorrow morning in the panel sessions and will be personally present, certainly to answer any questions that you would like to direct to him at that time. And he will also provide additional information. Thank you.
By the way, Dr. Douglas is a gentleman, so he wouldn't say this, but it has to be said that General Shana indeed did want to come and does want to be here today and did want to speak to the press. And as you know, he works for the Pentagon, and they prohibited him from coming here today, which fits the pattern that we are seeing develop throughout all these instances, which raises the question is how seriously does the U.S. government really intend to solve this problem, or do they pay lip service to it? Now, Mr. Perot is going to speak, for those of you who are wondering, but we still have a few more speakers that need to be heard. Well, we think they're very important. I know this next gentleman is very important. He was a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. He is very outspoken on this issue. He just recently went to Vietnam in early April. He has a few very strong comments to make. Orson Swindle.
I will try to be brief. I would concur with much of what has been said. We all come from different perspectives, and we have all tried in our own way to bring about some resolution to a very agonizing problem for certainly the families and for our country in general, I think. I just went to Vietnam in April with the Muskie delegation. Louder? I've never been told that I spoke too softly. Can you hear me in the back? If you can't, say no. Okay, so you can hear me. I went with this delegation somewhat unknowing as to its nature. I did not know anyone with the group. We went over there. Every person in the group is a fine person. They just have different agendas. The group consisted of a person who represents oil brokerage, and we know there's a little bit of oil around Indochina and Vietnam in particular. One person in the group represented Vietnam American Trade Association, who had been in Vietnam a number of times. Another person was aspiring to and since has been appointed an Assistant Secretary of State position by the Clinton administration. There was me and a few others who came from political offices. I don't know that you could describe this group as objective. The intent was to look and see if the conditions were right to come back home and make a recommendation from the group to the President as to what he should do about the embargo, incidentally. The IMF issue sort of came up in the course of conversations. I was not that fully informed about the IMF decision. As I learned, it was to be made on the 29th of April. As you know, it was postponed, and we recently saw the aftermath of all that. The group came to the conclusion that definitely the Vietnamese had cooperated and had met the conditions of the roadmap, and therefore we should take the next step. There was a great concern, as I've heard echoed in our intelligence communities and the Joint Task Force, that if we do not, and you've just heard it from Mr. Benj, if we do not do something in response to the fine cooperation we receive from Vietnamese, they will shut off any further access to information. I totally disagree with that. I formally disagree with it in the report, and I would like to address the issue from that perspective, if I might, for just a minute. As you know, back in the spring of 1991, it was agreed with the Vietnamese and the Americans that we would follow a roadmap to normalization. The first two phases of that roadmap speak very emphatically in spirit and in words that the Vietnamese on their part, or for their part, will help us resolve the MIA cases, the investigation of last known alive cases, the repatriation of remains, and repatriation of any live POWs if there might be any. And they were to do this quickly and thoroughly. And it also said unilaterally, if I recall correctly. For our part, we were to open up access to American businesses, not formally, but they could go in and make contacts. And you're very familiar with this. We have complied with every single step of that. They have not. We know for a fact, our intelligence community knows for a fact, it's even said in the Senate investigation, that they do have information. They have not complied with the roadmap. So therefore, if one is to use the roadmap accomplishments as the justification for going ahead on the IMF, one absolutely has to be intending to do something else, because you cannot objectively make that decision to go forward that Mr. Clinton just did. I object to the decision by Mr. Clinton on the IMF for several reasons. Number one, the one I just addressed. They have not complied. Simply stated, they lie. The Vietnamese lie. They have always lied. They will always lie. The second point that I would make, they were to help in the democratization and certainly the freeing of the Cambodian people. It looked pretty good there for a while. They withdrew the army, but they're very much involved in Cambodia today. And if we give them economic aid or permit economic aid to go to them, it will shore up the communists in Vietnam in their control of the Vietnamese people and also facilitate their going into Cambodia in the near future. You remember, this is the same crowd that started some 50 years ago trying to dominate all of Indochina. They have always looked at Indochina as one place and they to be the rulers of. The third point that I would make, another reason why we should not be normalizing relations in any way, including the IMF sanctions, they are some of the world's premier abusers of human rights. Folks, if we stand for anything in this country, we ought to stand for the rights of individual human beings to have a free, unabused, as economically prosperous as possible life. The Vietnamese are absolute contradictions of that concept. They do not recognize the universality of human rights. They made that very clear with the Bangkok Declaration recently. We are doing something that we as a nation have never done, should never do, and it's quickly said, well, we've dealt with people who are oppressive in the past. Yes, we have, and we ought to be ashamed of it. We don't have to start a new one, do we? The last point that I would make is I have heard this argument that if we don't give them something, they will shut the doors on us. That's the same logic, certainly in my lifetime, that has led us to give financial assistance and moral support and every other kind to despots in Central America and perhaps all over this world, because we feared if we didn't give them money, they would turn to the Russians. And look at what it got us. It will get us no better here. And I commend you all for your persistence and your tenacity in hanging on to this. One thing we must all do is recognize that we are up against perhaps insurmountable forces that would shut this thing down and rake it under a rug. We must all work together and not have dissension among us in any way whatsoever. We have but a short time left to accomplish this, and I thank you for having me here and all the rest of us. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have one last speaker before Mr. Perot. He just came back with Senator Smith and that delegation to Vietnam that got back Monday. He is a lawyer. He was on all parts of this trip. He has some fascinating information that you have not heard about what went on in Vietnam in the past week. Vaughn Taylor.
On behalf of Bobby Garwood, who truly is a live prisoner held captive in Vietnam after the war, I thank you. Long ago, I stopped being Bobby's lawyer as an advocate because I came to like him as a person and to trust him and to believe in him that there is a great likelihood of many live Americans still alive in Southeast Asia. Bobby Garwood is a living example of that happening. A sad travesty is that he initially was not believed but by a handful of people. I believed in him, and fortunately, this country is very lucky to have Senator Smith and former Congressman Hendon who believed in him. I had the difficult job of telling my little girl, with whom I have limited time during the summer, why I had to go to Vietnam. And I put it to her very simply and very honestly, and she accepted it. It's because there are live prisoners still there, and we need to bring them back. Now, I want to dispel some myths that make me draw that conclusion so that they can be dispelled to the entire American public. First of all, Bobby Garwood didn't just come up in 1984 and say, by the way, there are some live Americans still in Southeast Asia. He said that when he passed his note out of Hanoi, that there were other Americans there. When I represented him at his court-martial, he told Dr. Benjamin Ogburn, still on active duty, a Navy captain, that he saw approximately 200 live Americans in the mid-70s being held against their will in Vietnam. He was just lucky enough to be able to get out. Now, Bobby has been criticized because he collaborated in 1968 and 1969 to a very minimal extent under extreme conditions of mental and physical torture. And if you want to condemn him for that, fine. But let me tell you, every POW I've talked to said that under those conditions, they would have done probably even worse. Now, Garwood never hurt anybody. He tried to help a lot of people. And yes, he didn't follow the exact letter of the Code of Conduct, but that Code of Conduct's been changed because we realized as military people, of which I used to be, that you can't make human beings perfect in that environment. And all you can do is get them to bounce back. Don't condemn them. But instead, this country condemned Garwood for what he did, and then, incredibly to me, set about debunking what he had to say. And someone or some group funded this trip to go back to Vietnam so that the Bobby Garwood case could really be won. I've lost a few cases in court. And let me tell you, I thought I was going to lose my first client in Vietnam. You must understand the courage that it took Bobby Garwood to leave his new wife and his daughter and go to Vietnam. He was not part of the Senate delegation. He was requested by Senator Smith to go. I did not go to Vietnam as Bobby's lawyer. I went to Vietnam as Bobby's friend and someone who could be there for the emotional times, and also because I wanted to see what was going to happen concerning what Bobby had said all along. And the most interesting thing of all is that every single detail that Bobby gave turned out to be true. Now, I'm talking about details that he gave through 6 years of debriefings with DIA. Imagine, why in the world would it take 6 years to debrief a person? It took 1 year just for them to decide they were going to debrief him. Now, that's inexcusable. I don't want to condemn the entire DIA because I've met some people in there who are good, honest, conscientious workers. But clearly, there has been a terrible injustice to the American public done by many people working on this matter. And Bobby and I finally felt that it was sad that I had turned him over to DIA. Bobby told me in detail what he knew right before the Wall Street Journal article came out. Bobby was not very trusting of his lawyers because he'd been abused by his original staff of attorneys. And I found out that he should go to DIA. That turned out to be a mistake. Thank God for the Senate Select Committee. I testified that that committee ought to exist at the request of Senator Smith, and it did a pretty good job. Senator Smith realized that there were things that needed to be done after that, and he's followed through on it. And this trip, I'm telling you, is probably the most important thing. Let me just give you one example, because I don't want to take any more time, but this is a very important example. Bobby Garwood, having no protection there, turned on one of the Vietnamese who was needling him on the first day we were there, Mr. Dick, and you've all seen that picture in the newspaper. And I was alarmed for Bobby's safety, so was Senator Smith. And when we got him out of that crowd and back to the hotel, believe me, since I was responsible, I felt, for him and his safety, I counseled him in the clearest terms that he could not possibly act like that again. The next morning, we went out to get on a Russian helicopter to fly around a valley where we had had a lot of intelligence reports concerning live Americans who might still be there right now. And everyone who was getting ready to get on that helicopter, and I, fascinated with the fact that it was a piece of Russian gear, decided I would take out my little camera and shoot a picture. And just as I was framing that picture, I heard the most awful shouting coming out of Bobby Garwood. And again, he was pointing at a person, if you don't mind my just illustrating, pointing and saying, "You're a murderer. You are responsible for the deaths of my friends. You are responsible for the torture of hundreds of Americans and thousands of Vietnamese." And he was pointing at a particular colonel. Now, I have, by luck, that photograph. It was a very tense moment. It delayed the trip on the helicopter for an hour and a half because they were so upset with Bobby for having done this. I have known Bobby for 13 years. I had to get between him and the colonel and continually push him back to keep him calm and tell him, "Think about Kathy. Think about your wife, Kathy. Bobby, think about Kathy." His eyes were going back to the back of his head. He was not in this world. I'm telling you, beyond any doubt whatsoever, that proved to me, along with what he was able to show at Tok Ba Lake, that he was telling the truth. And do you know what that means? This is what that means. It's absolutely important that you understand it, that he was a prisoner in Vietnam, a prisoner, not a willing collaborator. Yes, he collaborated some to survive. If he were here today, and he's not because his brother is literally dying of cancer, and he's at Bobby's home dying there, so Bobby can't be here. But he would tell you he's simply a survivor. And if you take a look at the records, there's nothing that Bobby did that is so very wrong, and there is nothing that he did that should cause this country not to believe in him. He is an American prisoner of war, and he was there and only got out by his own ingenuity. That's the only reason he got out. And he went back to Vietnam, risking his life and taking positions like this for you. That's why he went back, not for him, but for you, because he says he owes it to the family and to the men he still believes are there. And I believe in him. As I told the Senate Rules Committee, everything I've been able to check out about Bobby Garwood's story has checked out to be true. Now, I'm not someone with a crystal ball, but I've been a trial lawyer for 24 years, and I'm a certified military judge. I'm telling you, it's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It is proof beyond any doubt, in my opinion. Bobby Garwood was a prisoner until he got out himself in 1979, and something needs to be done to find out what happened to the rest of the people who were there then that he saw. I want to take this moment to honor the American who has spent most time, most money, and devotion to this subject by giving him this picture that's never been seen in the world before, to Ross Perot from me and Bobby Garwood.
Thank you very much. We've got a blow-up of this picture. I think it's very important for you to see the big blow-up and for Vaughn to explain to you exactly who this man is and what his duties were during the war. Just take, now, who's got the slide? Okay, it'll just take a minute. Vaughn, why don't you keep talking for a minute until, explain who he is while he set the slide.
I will. Bobby was convinced that that is the man who is responsible, as I said, for the torture and deaths of many American prisoners and South Vietnamese prisoners. Let me say a word of caution with regard to this picture. Don't become a vigilante group. Don't become angry necessarily at this man. One person's identification is not a court and is not a conviction. It perhaps is an indictment, and it is perhaps appropriate that this man be called upon by a tribunal, perhaps set up by the United Nations, to answer that charge. I will tell you that I have contacted General Phat. General Phat is a lieutenant general, 3 stars. He was the commander in Saigon of the South Vietnamese forces when Saigon fell. And General Phat says he also knows the man that Bobby is accusing and knows him to have been in charge of American prisoners. Now, my investigators had a lot of trouble understanding General Phat. So this is not an indictment, folks. Look at this as simply an accusation. The man ought to be called to answer. I'll tell you what Bobby Garwood told me his answer was. Now, I don't understand Vietnamese, but the answer from this man, whose name is Nguyen Thai, colonel, senior colonel, retired, his answer, according to Bobby in Vietnamese, was, "I was only following orders." Well, that doesn't work, as we know from the Nuremberg trials and the Yamashita trial. That is not a proper defense. It will not fly. And if this man is responsible, he should pay. If he is brought into a court or a tribunal, then perhaps for the first time ever we can stop getting this sort of smiling response we get out of the Vietnamese that is always a lie. Put some pressure on them and maybe we can find an answer. If we're going to do something like this, it needs to be done in accordance with the laws of war, the Hague and Geneva Conventions, and it should be done through the United Nations. And I'm not sure politically it's something we ought to do. One thing that ought to be considered as well is to all people forgive. That's going to be a hard thing to do, but it might be the most likely thing to do to get our men back.
Move the screen over this way and give me the lights off, please.
On the right, of course, is Bobby Garwood, pointing the accusatory finger and literally yelling at Colonel Nguyen Thai, calling him a murderer and labeling him as the man responsible for the torture and deaths of prisoners of the United States and Vietnam. According to Bobby, it required that man's signature to put any prisoner to death. And whenever that man came down to the camps, you knew someone was going to get hurt. Bobby Garwood, if he could have, would have literally popped that man's head off. The man with the pith helmet is the colonel, Colonel Nguyen Thai, that Bobby is accusing. Now, I think it's also appropriate to point out in the background, the tall man you'll recognize, of course, is Senator Smith. If Senator Smith had not been there on this trip, and if he had not been there to support Bobby Garwood, you would never hear any of this story, because Bobby Garwood had been put to death first by long torture in Vietnam and then put to death when he came back here. He was debunked totally until just a handful of people started to believe him. And as the senator told you, when he found that prison camp in Tac Ba Lake, contrary to every assertion of the DIA, it proved beyond any doubt that he was telling the truth, not just about that sighting, but you have to conclude then that he's telling the truth about every sighting. Why else would he risk his life? I've heard opponents say Bobby Garwood is just doing this for media attention. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Bobby told me on the way back, the war is over now for him. He has done everything he can for you folks and everything he can for the men that are left behind. He wants quiet anonymity for the rest of his life, which will probably be a lot shorter than it normally would have been because of what he had to endure over there. And he deserves that. But he would have been here today but for the fact of his dying brother.
Thank you very much. You can go ahead and turn the lights back up or whatever's normal. If I could get all of the children of MIAs to come forward now, I would appreciate it, because I first met you when you were tiny little children in nearly every case. And so just come down here in front, come over here with me. Now this young lady here is Colonel Robinson's daughter. Now, to all of you in the press, keep in mind, anybody here from Colonel Shelton's family, this man is still carried as a POW. I got a simple question. Since he's still a POW, why aren't we making any effort to get him out? Now, Colonel Robinson's picture, or people claiming to be Colonel Robinson or alleged to be Colonel Robinson, are floating all over the place. Can you imagine how that impacts the lives of his children, his family, the people who love him? Can you imagine what he has given up, if he's still alive, not to see these children grow up? Can you imagine what all these fathers have given up not to see these young people grow up? You can't help but admire the fact that they are here, because they are devoted to their fathers. Now, these are not people that are Dixie cups that you would just throw away and forget. These are very special people who went into combat for us. The principle is very simple. We cannot leave one living American behind on the battlefield. Now, did any of you make the Paris trip when you were little children? I did. You gave up your Christmas. You went to Paris. You begged to have a list of who was alive. And you embarrassed the North Vietnamese into giving it to you, right? You got it. There are individual cases, I can tell you, like Jerry Singleton, who was MIA, whose wife had a little boy who had never seen his dad. She just wore him down, and they finally admitted they had him. And they had to account for him at the end of the war, and they did. Great examples of individual heroism on the parts of the families. But the families should not have to carry the whole burden. You all sit down and be comfortable. But I did want to recognize you and thank your mothers and your fathers. Let me just sum up to you the principle involved. Number one, if there's one person left, and our government officially says there is one person left, then where is this person? And why don't they account for him? And the reason he was carried as a POW was because there was extensive evidence that he was still alive. Let's just start small. Looking for live POWs. I suggest to you that your highest priority, our nation's highest priority, should be to bring back those who are still living. I don't care whether in Russia, Vietnam, Laos, China, wherever they might be. I don't care what kind of physical or mental condition they're in. They're our men. We want them back, right? I ask the American people and the press to think how difficult it must be for these children and these families to listen to Dr. Douglas's explanations of how POWs were used. These are strong, courageous people who have endured just about everything, and they have heard these stories before. But each time you hear them, think about, what if it were someone you loved? That's why we have to get these people back. Now let's get down to brass tacks. Why do I believe people are there? Number one, in 1970, when I was in Laos, I was taken into the briefing room in the embassy, and the CIA and the key people representing the United States in that embassy briefed me on where the POWs were being held by the Laotians. I had two other people with me who will confirm that. It was confirmed before the committee, the Kerry Committee. The agency and the embassy first denied it and then said, gee, it must have happened, but we didn't remember it. Second, my point very simply is, why would they bring, I was over there at the request of the president on the Christmas trip. Why would they bring me in, brief me on people who were prisoners in Laos, unless they thought they were there? And secondly, since only 9 came out of Laos, what happened to the rest? Because several hundred were left in Laos. Then, after that, I had a lot of contact with Continental Air Services and Air America, the people who were working with the agency. On one of my trips to Laos, I stayed in their compound outside Vientiane, and they just talked openly and freely, and it was just a given that there were POWs being held in Laos. Then, on my second trip, I went to see the senior Pathet Lao official in Vientiane, visited with him. He openly talked and boasted about holding POWs. I asked him in that meeting if he would give the families a list, because it would mean so much to them to know that these people were still alive. He replied, I see no reason why not. Come back tomorrow. I came back the next day. In a very polite way, he apologized and said he had been told he could not give me the list. Why make such statements unless they held men? Now we come to 1973. The Paris peace talks are underway. The negotiations were going on with Vietnam. The question was raised, how do we get the men out of Laos? Our negotiators in Paris said, we will get them through the Paris talks. Within the next few days, the Pathet Lao in Laos said, oh no, you will have to deal with us directly. Interesting. And then during that period, the Pathet Lao boasted that they held tens of American prisoners. I always assumed that just meant large numbers. I never knew quite what it meant. Years later, I met the general in charge of Royal Lao Intelligence, who had a PhD from a French university, and I asked him what the term tens of would mean. No, first I asked him, did the Pathet Lao have prisoners? He said, yes, large numbers of American prisoners. I said, well, what did they mean when they said tens of tens? He said, they held them in groups of 10. And they had large numbers of groups of 10, is what they were trying to say. In late March 1973, right after our POWs had come out of Hanoi, and keep in mind, we got those POWs because we promised to pay reparations. Go back and look at the war that Vietnam had with France. They held people back till they got everything they thought they were going to get. If they didn't get it, they didn't release them. It's an old practice. History repeats itself. We promised it, but we hadn't paid it. So they sent the people out of Hanoi, sent 9 people total from Laos, and that was in February of 1973. In late March 1973, Congress had decided that they would not pay reparations. There is a declassified memo that I hope every member of the press will personally get, read, and study, where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense are saying we're going to have to start bombing again in order to get the prisoners. Why would you write such a memo unless prisoners were there? Pretty simple stuff. 2 weeks later, approximately, Dr. Roger Shields was ordered, and this is all a matter of record now, it's in the testimony, to announce that there are no more living Americans in Southeast Asia. Correlate those two for me, if you will. Isn't it fair for Americans to ask what happened in that 2-week period? At one moment, we were going to bomb to get the people back, and 2 weeks later, we declared them dead. Now, remember that. We declared them dead in March 1973. One of the great tragedies that occurred here was Watergate. Plus the fact the American people had no stomach for anything in Southeast Asia at that time. Dr. Kissinger is dead right when he said he had no leverage to do much at that point. Now, time goes by. Suddenly, in the mid-'80s, I was asked by the former head of the CIA and the Vice President of the United States and the head of the DIA, just before that, an interesting thing happened. General Ty retired in the earlier than that. He testified before Congress just as he was retiring and did a very brave thing. He bluntly said he thought we left men behind. Now, keep in mind, till that point, everybody said no. Now, by the end of the Kerry Committee, everybody said, oh, we left them behind, but now they're dead. There's a presumption of death all the way through here, and I propose that we need to change that to a presumption of life. Well, anyhow, I was asked by the head of the DIA, first by the Vice President, former head of the CIA, head of the DIA, 2 people who clearly understood intelligence, to buy a videotape that purportedly showed American prisoners being used as slave laborers in the Golden Triangle. The man who had it was in jail in Singapore. You don't want to hear the details. It takes too long. But to make a long story short, I got him out of jail. I called him and said, you'll never hear from him again because this is not, the cleanest situation in the world, which they had told me on day one. I said he'll probably disappear. A few days later, he called me from Bangkok where he claimed he had the tape, said he was ready to come to the United States. In the meantime, I kept briefing them. I briefed them on his plans. I briefed him on when he would arrive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the middle of all that, the arrangement they had made with me is that if I would get the tape and I would pay for the tape, which was costing several $1 million, the federal government would reimburse me if the tape were authentic. And I said, fine. In the middle of it, I got an anguishing call about what a terrible person this man was. I finally laughed and I said, well, he was in jail in Singapore when we started, so, he probably wasn't a member of the Yale Skull and Bones Club. To make a long story short, anguishing and saying, then I got another call from a staffer. First time a staffer had called me, it'd always been the top 2 guys, saying, we've had a change in government policy. We will not reimburse you for the tape. Once they knew they were going to get it, they started to run from it. Then I said, who made that policy decision? He said, I don't know. And my direct words were, well, surely his mother thought enough of him to give him a name when he was born. And I'll go ahead and pay for the tape, but I'd like to know who made the decision. I never found out. I said, let me speak to the Vice President. They said he's out of the country. I said, all right, ask him to call me when he comes back. Didn't hear from him. Now, the guy's coming in. I'm keeping everybody posted. He's supposed to bring me the tape. I'm going to pay for it, and hopefully it's authentic. Federal agents tried to arrest him when he landed in the United States. He evaded them, and the rest is history. Now, why do I tell you this long, tedious story? 2 of the most senior people in terms of intelligence and knowledge in our country thought enough of trying to get that tape to ask me to spend several $1 million for it, get a man out of jail in Singapore, bring him to this country, then they tried to snatch it from him and lost it. But the facts are, why would you go through that drill unless you thought there was at least some plausibility that we had live Americans? We have declassified documents that Mr. Santoli has with him, if you're interested in the press, showing how many prison systems we've had under surveillance. And you say, was there a second tier? When you look at all the ones we were watching, it looks like to me there was more than 2 tiers that we've been observing. You've heard the ground satellite stories. How likely is it that somebody is going to be able to come up with Serex's name, put it on the ground when, in 93 or 92? Very recently. And of course, again, there is a mindset to debunk within the intelligence community, to quote their own people. There's a preoccupation with remains. I propose to the League of Families we should have a preoccupation and the highest priority, even if it's the only priority for the time being, with living Americans. If we can forgive, and we are a forgiving nation, if we can forgive the North Vietnamese for the atrocities they committed to the men who came home, and if you got these guys to open up that were here today that are former POWs, you'd have trouble forgiving them. But they would say, go ahead and forgive them for that. And if we can forgive all of our people in our country who did not serve during this war, and we have done that and we should do that, and if we can forgive the IMF loans, and we're doing that, can't we find it in our hearts not to forget the men who might still be alive? That's all I have. I was asked by the President and Vice President to do one last study of the MIA situation, POW situation in 1986. I first said no because you won't do anything. They assured me they would. I did the study. Suddenly in the middle of it, the Vietnamese invited me to come see them. I went to see them. Interesting conversation. Conversation opened with, why are you here? I said, because you invited me. And they laughed. And then they said, we hold no living Americans under our direct control. You've heard that one before, under our direct control. And I said, don't embarrass yourselves, I know too much. And they laughed. They said, we heard you're direct, we're direct too, we'll get along fine. Then they said the most important thing they ever said to me. Why would we think your government wants these men back because you have declared them all dead? It's the most important words I ever heard from the North Vietnamese. Now I ask you to go get the declassified document written between the National Security Council and the Vice President's office saying that somehow, and I didn't know this until 1992 when it was declassified, the Vietnamese wanted to negotiate with me. And everybody between the National Security Council and the Vice President's office was in a panic. And the two statements that will leap at you off those pages are, number one, Perot's agenda is different from our agenda. Then you say, well, what does that mean by that? Then they go on to say, how would it look if someone came out after all these years? Now, here is my answer. Let's quit worrying about how things look. Let's bring them out. I think your challenge, and I will help you any way I can, is to make sure he has a full understanding of this issue, and there is no reason to believe he does. Believe me, he's not going to get it through the intelligence community. That's right. Now, but the facts are on the table because they have declassified too many documents, and whoever was in charge of shredding didn't do a very good job. Okay? You'd think they would have at least gotten some of this stuff that came out of the Vice President's office and the National Security Council. But anyhow, there's a lot of stuff floating around if anybody will look at it. I think your challenge is to get all the facts and to get a full hearing from the President before he takes that all-important step of recognition. Now, the final deal is not done on the IMF. As a negotiator, I agree with Orson. You know, you don't start giving away your aces at the beginning of a negotiation. I can assure you that millions of ordinary, hardworking Americans do not want to spend taxpayer money until this matter is resolved. And as was pointed out earlier, once we start giving IMF loans, that is roughly 20 cents of every dollar comes from the U.S. We do want to put this behind us. We can put it behind us and clear the record. Now, I hate to say this to the families here, but let's assume that somewhere out there, there are people alive who have been damaged badly by these experiments that the Dr. Douglas talked about. I want them to spend the rest of their life here. I don't care what it costs a day to keep them. I've talked to a lot of the families about this. There's nothing y'all can't handle at this point. I know that. Let me give you a tough one, though. We've talked about it before. The worst thing that happened to these great people is when they finally broke them. And just about if you don't kill a guy, you can break him. Just remember that. If you don't foul up the torture, you'll eventually break him. And they feel so bad because of the old Code of Military Conduct. And thank God we changed it. Now, in the POW camps, they rallied together and rebuilt the people. But now let's assume a person made of steel was in a place by himself in a remote area, was broken through torture, and nobody was ever around to explain to him that nobody can endure it unless they kill you. And if you'll remember, our Congressional Medal of Honor winner, Jim Stockdale, tried to take his own life. Now, he is nobody's sissy, and all the guys who served with him would swear by him. But in other words, trying to maintain his integrity, he tried to take his life. Now, let's assume a person endured all that, got broken. He's sitting over there for 20 years feeling like a traitor, when in fact, he's a hero, right? He's a hero. Now, you remember the welcome home we gave the POWs? And it broke my heart that we didn't have your husbands and fathers and loved ones, sons and loved ones there. Brothers, it will be small potatoes compared to the welcome home we'll give this group when we get them. And if we don't owe it, let's go out, leave this group, and go to Grassroots America. If you don't think we owe this much effort to these people, and I'm sure you do, we certainly owe it to everybody who went on the battlefield in Vietnam, who came home and was treated badly. It's a sad chapter in our country's history. Never forget that the people who rebuilt the Pentagon and gave us the finest fighting machine in the world were the people who came back from the battlefield in Vietnam. We never thank them. Now, I know those folks, and I know them well. And one of the happiest days of my life is I was in charge of the regional parade down in Dallas for the Desert Storm group. And the fun part was I got to deal with all the guys when they came into town. I talked to the guys in Desert Storm. No, I first went to the guys from Vietnam in the 8 states and said, we want you in the parade. And they said, no, we don't want to be recognized. We fought for 11 years. Nobody cared. These guys fought for 100 hours. The guys ran the whole time. To hell with it. And finally, I looked them in the eye and I said, do it for me. It's the first thing I'd ever ask them to do. And they looked and said, oh, okay, they'll do it. Now, here's the part I love. The guys from Desert Storm came into town. I met with them and I said, look, it's your parade. You determine the sequence, but I got the Vietnam veterans marching in it. They said, put them in front of us because they did some heavy-duty fighting. We didn't. Then the generals and the admirals came into town, and I said, you guys are scheduled to lead the parade, but here's who's marching. And they said, put us behind the Vietnam guys, in front of the Desert Storm guys, because we fought with both groups. Congressional Medal of Honor winners from World War II on led the parade. Those Vietnam veterans, as they went down the street with hundreds of, huge crowd, the one thing we couldn't control is crowd reaction when they turned the corner. The crowd acted like Michael Jackson had come on the stage. It went crazy. They were crying openly as confetti poured down on them. And again and again and again at the end of the parade, with tears still streaming down their faces, and these are guys that don't cry easy. They said, it's the best day I've had since I came home. I'll tell you this, since I know these folks and you know these folks, and we've got folks like this in the audience, If you could say, I'll grant you one wish before you turn out the lights, at least 9 out of 10 would say, whoever's left over there, get them home. Get them home. That's it. Now, it's a privilege to be with you. My heart goes out to you. Some of the greatest heroes this country has ever had, whoever's still alive, is over there. And I'll tell you one last call I got from a very high level a few years ago. He said, Ross, don't you remember? No, there are not many left. I said, okay. He said, don't you know that they're old? I said, okay. He said, don't you know that their children are grown? I said, yes. He said, don't you know that some of the wives have remarried? I said, yes. He said, don't you understand that they're going to be angry when they come home because we left them so long? And I said, okay. And I said, anything else? He said, no. I said, don't you understand that you are saying again and again and again that there's still someone alive over there? Pretty simple, right? They're trying to say, back off, back off. This is complicated. This looks bad politically. I contend that whoever has the courage, like Senator Smith, now we're going to, God bless him and the handful of people who stand there. Now, all this, sure, do business with Vietnam, fine, after all this is cleared up. Real world, let's assume you just can't wait to drill for oil, or whatever it is that drives everybody crazy over there. Go to Russia. There's some really big oil fields there, right? I mean, there's other places to go drill for oil if you want to find the elephants. So the opportunities are not limited to that little country. It's sort of silly to use that as a priority to rush this thing through. And let's put it in plain Texas talk. When there's a human life of one of our armed forces members at risk, on the one hand, and money at risk on the other hand, the money doesn't count. Fair enough? Okay. No question in my mind that our president is a caring, compassionate person. We have a challenge, and that is to make sure he gets all of the knowledge of the status of these people, and I am confident he will do the right thing. Privileged to be with you, and we'll now turn it back over to you and I'll take any questions you might have. Yes, first. Other people have better and more recent information. The one thing, this young man here from Vietnam, I'm not sure you heard him or understood him, but I want to make sure that the press members and everybody here understands that he was a member of the foreign ministry, and he says they openly discussed the American prisoners they still held. Now, talk about courage and guts. Can you imagine how many people are going to be bothering this young guy? Well, they're going to have to bother me to get to him, I'll tell you that. Thank you very much.
We'd like the questions from the press right now because Mr. Perot will be talking to the families in just a few minutes.
If anybody from the press is still here, thank you for your patience, but I hope you have and you share my empathy for what these families have gone through and what it would be like to have to grow up without your dad or to lose your son, and the saddest guys of all are the fathers. If you ever come to my office, right outside my office is a very elderly man hugging his son who came home. What would Colonel Hopper give to hug his son coming home? And the other dads here today. Jeff, what would you give to shake hands and hug your brother after all these years? And I could just go through the list. God bless you all for staying the course. Yes, sir.
Reed Irvine, Accuracy in Media. Mr. Perot, you mentioned the press. I'd like to get your comment on what role our national media have played in this matter when you think that our leading commentators, columnists like George Will and Sapphire and Buckley, you go down the list, you can name them, people on radio like Rush Limbaugh and so on, have said nothing or virtually nothing about this issue and conveyed this message that you've conveyed here today. What is your comment?
I don't think they're being negligent. Here we have so many things happening, and if you're a newsman, you need to write what the big news is. I hate to say this for the families here, but the facts are this is a matter that intensely affects a small number of people. On the other hand, when you raise it to the level of principle, which we are doing right now, every ordinary, hard-working American in this country will move heaven and earth to make sure this happens. And the one thing I can pledge to you now is that the people in our organization, United We Stand, will be squarely with you in every city, town, and congressional district in this country saying, now, yes, sir, but the point is, it's not news because it just is a crushing burden to a tiny number of people. Once you raise it up to the level of a principle, it's big news.
See a document coming out of Moscow saying that there were 1,205 prisoners when they were only admitting holding 368.
Yes.
And that becomes a one-day story, and immediately even the night it's released, it's being debunked on ABC News, taking the message from the Pentagon.
But you
have any comment on whether that is a proper...
No, this is the way the system works here. It's called a quick response team. Everybody in intelligence has been to school and formally trained on dissembling and debunking. And the fact that they do it well should come as no surprise.
What about the media?
Well, anyhow, the point is, you raise an interesting point on this. Who is General Quang? Just a second. Bear with me, folks. Who is General Quang? This is the general that spoke in the Russian document. Now, is Al Santoli still here? Al, where are you? Okay. I want you to understand we've got declassified documents that show that this general, who is described by the Vietnamese, is a nobody, is a big-time somebody, and was during the war and had direct line control and command in the area of the Ho Chi Minh Trail where the prisoners were being moved. This is not a person of no consequence as he has been presented. We have a tendency, this is interesting, to believe everything the Vietnamese say and nothing that our people say. It's the presumption of death. It's the debunking mindset that they talk about in the intelligence community. We need to say, all of us, regardless of our religion, I think, believe in the Bible verse, not even a sparrow falls to the ground without God's care. Well, these are eagles that fell to the ground, folks. Now, we can't leave them. It's the principle. Now, give us a quick brief on who General, this is like saying that, Eisenhower was not very important in World War II. Now, quickly, give me the other stuff on General Quang.
Okay. General Quang, from 1965 to 75, was the commander of Military Region 4, which was in the central area and southern area of North Vietnam. It extended from Thanh Hoa, where the Soviets had built an airfield called Bai Thung, where they had a number of advisors and experts who coordinated with flights from the area around Hanoi to the Sam Nua area to the Vieng Sai area of Laos, which is significant because of the movement of American prisoners from these various bases between Vietnam and Laos. More importantly, Military Region 4 also had the area of operations that included the Ho Chi Minh Trail area of Laos, where more than 70% of our prisoners were captured, and for others that were moved up from South Vietnam were transported. General Quang's headquarters, which was at Vinh, and they had a secondary headquarters at Nha An, which was closer to the Lao border, would have had records, documentation, and all type of cable traffic, landline cable traffic that our people intercepted on the movement, capture, and holding of American prisoners in those areas. And for him to say that he had no relation, no knowledge, is a complete fabrication on his part. Number two, General Quang, from the early 60s on through into the 70s, was a member of the Central Military Party Committee, which was kind of like our National Security Council. He was involved in making war, making policy, and a big part of that, especially in negotiations, was American prisoners. Number three, I know the press is not very interested, but this is critical. If you're going to get honest answers for the Vietnamese, you have to hold them accountable to the truth. Okay? General Quang, in the 1950s, was the director of the Enemy Proselytizing Department, which was the organization in the Vietnamese military responsible for holding American or French prisoners at that time, but later on the American prisoners. After the French War, they held on to French prisoners after they reportedly were all released. More importantly, the Enemy Proselytizing Department, Vietnam saw all of Indochina as one battlefield. So the prisoners they captured in Laos were included in the number along with the prisoners captured in North Vietnam and South Vietnam and Cambodia. This is essential when you look at the numbers in his document. Because is he only talking about prisoners in North Vietnam, or is he also talking about the 500 some odd prisoners that our own diplomats before the Senate committee said were under the control of the North Vietnamese or under the path at Lao with North Vietnamese advisors? And this is critical in understanding that they have not been honest. Now, let's add one more point. When General Vesey came back from Vietnam asking, would General Quang lie to me? And he held up a blue book and said that every American prisoner released from Vietnam name was signed into this blue book, right? It was a dog-eared old document that the North Vietnamese just happened to find. There are two prisoners here who were released in 1973 from Vietnam, Michael Benge and Orson Swindle, who did not sign that blue book and whose names were not in that blue book. That proved absolutely nothing. And for General Vesey to tell the press that that proved that all American prisoners were returned is, on his part, disingenuous, and it also shows he is not competent to be in the position of dealing with the Vietnamese.
Now, I suggest to you, just 1 second, sir, and I'll take you quiet. Our highest priority, and I hope we can do this. There are understandably huge emotions within the families. These emotions have even caused your group to have stress and break into two groups. I think job and priority number one is to come together and stick together until this is done. And put it all behind you, because you have the same mission, and that is to get everybody back that's still alive and get them back quickly, because every day is precious. Right? Fine. I urge you to do that. History does repeat itself. In 1969, I was called in the office of Dr. Henry Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger was there by himself. President Nixon had asked me to become involved to embarrass the North Vietnamese into changing the treatment of the POWs so that more people could survive at the time the war was finished, and they anticipated it would take 3 years to Vietnamize it, and that under the present brutal treatment, half the men would die of brutality and neglect. We mobilized the families. You mobilized yourselves. I shouldn't say we. You mobilized the families. You went all over the world, women and little children and dads and mothers. And the press gave you front page coverage, and the TV networks gave you front page coverage. Talk to the guys in the POW camps. Get the names of the people who had memorized the dates that the treatment changed, and track it by the press coverage. Track it by the press coverage. The one thing the Vietnamese are sensitive to is American public opinion. The reason they were so rude to Senator Smith and everybody last week, they think we just handed them all 52 cards in the deck. Now, once they see that the American public is going to draw a line in the sand, then we're going to get back to business. Business is pretty simple. They are very sensitive to American public opinion, and I'll leave you with this thought. I understand that the press has to set its own priorities, has to decide what the important stories are. You held the lives of these men in the palms of your hands from the 60s to 73. You did more than anybody else in the world to change their treatment, to see that they came out, as many came out as did. You were the force that caused the Vietnamese to stop torturing them and to give them medicine and to give them an adequate diet. You can do it again. I hope you'll see fit to do it. Yes, sir.
Joseph Gold, Accuracy and Media Report. The way I heard your remarks, you sounded really conciliatory towards President Clinton, as if you were saying he's probably been ill-briefed or not briefed at all on the subject, the real intricacies about this. My question, sir, is this. How long will you let him go before you start holding him accountable for what's happening? And secondly, will he be held accountable for this in 1996 if he doesn't push it through to a real resolution?
I'll bet you a big Texas steak that we never come to that, because I bet he's going to get interested in it, focus on it, because let's be fair, let's be honest. If you watch him, he is a caring, compassionate person. But now you get up every morning and the whole world implodes on you when you're president, And until you understand this issue, and there's no reason why he really would, right? There's nobody right around him briefing him on him, to the best of my knowledge. He was kind enough to see the families. Just think about it. How long did he spend with you in the meeting?
45 minutes.
45 minutes with the president. Not bad for an outfit with, what, a few hundred members, right?
That's right.
Now, let's pull back, let's stay positive, and let's give it, what's our goal? To get our men back, right? That's all. Forget the rest of it. Forget the rest of it. Now, listen, yes, ma'am.
I'm Willoughby Vance, National Federation of Press Women, and you're talking about the presumption of death, and I'm here to tell you that we have a POW MIA widow being persecuted in Orange County, California. She was dragged from her home, tied to a gurney, taken to a mental home, faced a false arrest, is threatened with foreclosure on her home, $24,000 in fines, and her crime is to put up a POW MIA flag, to take your banners and your books, not for sale at any price, to carry the message of the POW and the MIA. And I am pleading with everybody here, Vera Armstrong Sherry, to get behind her, because on the 20th of this month, they plan to put her in jail in Orange County and start proceedings against her home, and we've been unable to protect her civil rights, the First and 14th Amendment. Vera Armstrong Sherry.
Make sure I get the name, telephone number.
Right there in the banner, around her head.
Question over here. Yes, ma'am. I never discuss any conversations I have with any government official. If they want to, that's their prerogative. Keep in mind and bear with me, and that's a very fair question for you to ask. I got one interest, and that is if there's one person there. And I'm a very pragmatic person. If I didn't think there was anybody there, I wouldn't be wasting time here. It's pretty simple. You know, I am not wrapped around the post on this issue. I am wrapped around the facts on this issue. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go. We've had the meeting I wanted to have with the families. I've covered everything I wanted to cover with you. Dolores, I would like for you and the families to have a private meeting. You all call me in Dallas tomorrow about anything and follow up. It's a privilege to be with you, and the thing I want you to know, because I spend a good part of my life out there where the rubber meets the road with the American people, there's nobody they love more than the men and women in uniform. There's nobody they'll do more for than the men and women in uniform. And to show you how good they are, for example, as I was talking about having them all focus on this, everywhere the rivers are flooding, all the members of United We Stand are out there helping the folks that need help. So, with that kind of mindset, you don't have to worry if they'll come circle the wagons for you. We will, and our challenge is to take this old, open wound and heal it and get our men home. Thank you very much.
The National Alliance of Families works to gather information on and create public awareness of the issue of missing servicemen. Comments about this news conference can be forwarded to the National Alliance of Families, Post Office Box 403.